Um, Thanks for being here. I'm Tegan Hanlon. I'm a board member at Alaska Press Club and work at Alaska Public Media. And yeah, I'm glad so many folks are on this morning. I'm really excited for this session. It is The Art of the Interview with our moderator, Annie Feit from Alaska Public Media, and our two panelists, Michelle Theriault-Boots from the Anchorage Daily News, and Emily Kwong, formerly of KCAW in Sitka, and currently a host of NPR's Shortwave. But really quick, before we get into it, just wanted to give two big thank yous. One, thank you all for being here, for being members of Alaska Press Club. Your membership helps us leverage grant funding to put on events like this. And also a big thanks to the Atwood Foundation, a huge supporter of journalism in Alaska, and also who has helped make this conference possible. So I'll hand it over to you all. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Tegan. And yeah, thanks to everyone who's tuning in really early on a Monday morning. I know that's not easy. I really wanted to hold this session because I think interviewing is one of those things that is so fundamental. It's almost like so fundamental to journalism, we don't talk about it very much, and how to get better at it. And Emily and Michelle are the perfect people to talk about it because they've done hundreds of interviews in their careers and learned a ton along the way. When we were preparing for the session, we realized we could probably fill hours with this topic. So we will get going quickly here to try to get as much in as possible. So yeah, I'll start, Michelle, with you with kind of the basic, like, how do you get people to agree to talk with you?
I think the best way to get people to agree to talk with you is to just be super straightforward and transparent. I like to usually start, unless I'm on like a really tight deadline and I need to do a very kind of like fact extractive interview, with an email just saying who I am, what I'm writing about, and why I would like their perspective. And I feel like people seeing that in words rather than a call on the phone sometimes helps them to feel more comfortable and to really consider whether they want to be interviewed or not. And then also there are times when you're like out at the scene of news and you want to interview someone, and I just try to approach them kind of humbly and tell them who I am and why I want to talk to them. And usually it works. I mean, sometimes you have to go back time, over and over to get someone kind of like a high priority interview to talk to you. But usually I think if people believe that you're going to be fair and listen to them, they'll do it.
Yeah. And Emily, what do you think are the most important things to convey when you are making that ask of someone, and they've maybe even agreed to it, but they don't probably fully understand what they're getting themselves into?
Yeah, it is, I think the hardest. Hi, everyone. First of all, it's so good to see so many former colleagues in the chat who are holding it down in Alaska and doing like the best work ever. I think the local newsrooms in Alaska are phenomenal, and I appreciate it like more and more since leaving the system. I think the ask is everything Michelle said is so true about how the introduction really matters, especially if you don't have any relationship with that person. And I think cold calling is the hardest thing for brand new journalists to learn. There were so many interns and fellows who came through KCAW where they would have ideas, they would have sources, but at the end of the day, they just struggled to pick up the phone. They were just so afraid to pick up the phone and make a phone call. And Rachel Waldholtz, who used to work at KCAW with me, her dad was a print journalist, and he had this motto, JCTF, just call the effer, just call them, like there's no shortcut to actually just reaching out. So I just want to say that first, like simply not getting too in your head about it and not waiting for like the right time to reach out to them. There is no right time. Just call the fucker. Just reach out to them. Just make the attempt, and know that there is no perfect cold call outreach that can happen. It all happens later in the relationship that you build once you're in that conversation. So simply not overthinking it, is, yeah, even after 20 years, it can sometimes still be scary. Yes. And I've procrastinated on reach out to sources, but then I've gotten better in my career at asking myself, like, why? Why am I not reaching out to this person? Is it because I don't feel prepared? Is it because I don't feel like qualified to do this? And having to work on those deeper answers means I'm less hesitant to reach out. Once you do, I think setting expectations, we're going to talk more about this, setting expectations about what they can expect from an interview with you and building trust are the two things that need to happen before you start asking questions. So we could talk a little more in detail about what that looks like, but expectations and trust are the two things I think about to result in an actual interview that's good.
Yeah, and we can talk more about that. What do you do to prepare for an interview? I guess once you've maybe made that first call and you know that person is game.
I guess this has changed for me a little bit. I think in sort of daily newspaper journalism, you often don't have a lot of time to prepare. You might know, okay, these are some questions. This is why I'm calling this person. These are some questions I definitely want to ask them. But I unless you're doing kind of a much more in-depth project, I feel like I have rarely had the time to fully, truly prepare. And I had been working on this podcast project for several months, of very much a long form narrative thing. And the preparation that we would do for each interview, the producer and I, was extensive, and it involved really thinking about what can this person bring to the story? What is their role in the story in a perfect world? And kind of coming up with, Emily and I have talked about this a little bit, a mission statement for the interview. What do I want to get out of this interview? The interview is not going to be over until I get this question asked, or this is the highest possible use of the interview. And then, really spending some time thinking about how to ask the questions that can lead the person there, the open-ended questions that can kind of take the person on a journey through the interview, where you're going to get both the information, but also the insight from that person. So that's since I've been back, not working on this podcast project, I've tried to apply that to the few stories I've done since I've been back at the ADN doing kind of, everyday stories. And it's kind of a revelation to me to really just think about what is the mission of the interview. And of course, you're reading about the person, you're preparing yourself to talk to them. So you're going in knowing the appropriate amount of background about the person, but also giving yourself room to learn about them and be surprised. And
yeah. Emily, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do think that it's like a pendulum. You can be over prepared and close-minded, and you can be under prepared and flailing. Finding that balance is really something that comes with time. I think it was Susan Orlean who had this tactic of actually not preparing at all. She would do her conversation. She's a nonfiction, creative nonfiction writer, print writer. She wouldn't prepare at all. She'd just go into her interviews cold. But she had the luxury of many, 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 many more interviews upon which to build a profile. Terry Gross, opposite end of the spectrum. I've heard Terry Gross reads every single thing that person has written, previous interviews they've done. So you will find yours somewhere in the middle. And I think it's very person dependent. And also, like Michelle's saying, it's very job dependent, because sometimes you truly don't have the time to prepare. So I actually like to, for work-life balance, just give myself a time limit on how much preparation I do. I have an hour to prepare for this interview today, and I have an hour tomorrow, and that's it. I set a timer. And then I really try to prioritize what would be the best article, TED Talk, phone call I can make to someone who knows them, getting some background about them that might provide, what would be the right prep in the time I have. And this is not something I realized early on. I think I just always felt like I was underprepared, but that's life. So how do you like sustain a journalism career for hopefully years? Is you're really like kind to yourself about how much you can realistically prepare for any given interview. And then when you decide that, it will start to become clear like what you really have time for. You might not have time to read the whole book, but you could maybe read the first chapter, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Michelle, you talked a little bit about the podcast project that you've been working on, and how that has informed your interviewing. Can you expand on that a little more? Just like, how has it changed how you're interviewing still for your print pieces?
Yeah, I guess I've been thinking that like for my job, I kind of put interviews into a couple of different categories where I'm often interviewing like public officials, people within government, experts, and then I do quite a lot of interviewing what I would just call civilians, just everyday people who are in the news because they're experiencing something that is newsworthy, right? And for the kind of government officials or experts, I tend to always have thought of those as very like extractive interviews. Like you're there on a mission to like get them to comment on something or to react to something or to tell you, facts, to tell you new information. And for the sort of civilians, you're there to like emotionally know their experience. And that is a very different, I think, interviewing skill set. It's much more free form. I rarely like would write and prepare questions because it seems so natural to just have a conversation with someone about their life. But the difference is in print journalism, you have kind of infinite chances to get what you want out of interviews. Like it doesn't all have to be in one shot. And then in podcast or like in audio, you need to get people to say things on tape, right? Like you can't, if they're not completing the thought or you've botched the question, you might be able to go back and try it again with them, but there's nothing like that first fresh attempt. So what I've learned from that is that I think audio interviewing requires much more prep because you really have to be very deliberate, I think, about what you're asking, how you're asking it, and are you asking it in a way that is going to allow the person to speak and say what they have to say in a compelling way that's not fragmented. And whereas in print, it's okay, right? If they don't quite make the thought, you can call them back and say like, hey, like we were talking about this thing and let's talk more about that. Whereas I feel like in audio, you kind of have like a one shot to get it like really right. So that has changed the way I prepare for interviews, with much more, I guess, deliberate thought and preparation into like, what is that mission statement thing? Like, what is the purpose of this interview? No matter how small, no matter if it's the third expert on cleaning tear gas out of apartments you've tried to call, that was me last week. Like, what is this person's highest potential purpose in the interview? And exactly what questions should I be asking them to get there? So I don't know. I mean, that may all be extremely already like second nature to many audio reporters and maybe print reporters too. But for me, it's been kind of a revelation. Oh, I think you're on mute, Annie.
Somehow I hit mute there. Are there things that you brought to the team, the audio team you were working with from print that, helped them and changed their style at all? I mean, I think there's usually a give and take there.
Yeah, I think that what I brought to the table was like kind of a very deep knowledge of Anchorage in Alaska, kind of the arena that we were reporting in, and like a real willingness, like I have been doing this at the Anchorage Daily News for over a decade. I've had a lot of people yell at me on the phone. I've had a lot of people slam the phone down. I've had people, slam doors on my face. Like I've had really tense and difficult interviews that I wanted to cry afterwards, and it's really hard to like bother me now. And so, you know, there were some people we were trying to contact that we knew really didn't want to talk to us, didn't want to do this. And I think it was harder for some of my producing partners to kind of like I felt like I had some pretty good ideas of how to make our case to those people, and to kind of brush it off. So I think that's a function of just literally doing thousands of interviews with such a variety of people.
Yeah. One thing that I feel like we're not as good at in radio is interviewing for facts. I mean, partly because we don't need quite as many facts in our stories as you guys do in print. Is that something that you've thought more about, the distinction between those two things, with your new experience?
Yeah. I would say frustratingly, honestly, like interviewing for facts for me, often involves dealing with some kind of government entity, and increasingly, it's not an interview that you get. It's an you're emailing questions, and you're not ever given the opportunity to do a free-ranging interview with someone. You're emailing a set of questions, and you're getting a vetted set of. I see Olivia in the comments, right? And that's something that disturbs me greatly, because I feel like it's really diminishing how often I am able to do this kind of accountability interviews for facts, rather than craft a set of questions that are vetted by like probably 10 different people. But I don't know. I mean, Emily, you interview scientists all the time. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think, it's so interesting to listen to this, because I do think that local reporters have such an advantage, being their community's reporter, their community's journalists, in the sense of access, expectations, and trust. But it can kind of go both ways, because you can assume people know what you're about and they actually don't. So I think, you know, with me interviewing scientists at the national level, I'm never a part of their community. They'll never meet me in person. It's a real difference. But when I was at KCAW, I think that one thing that Rob Woolsey, our news director, really encouraged us to do was, when a new official arrived in town, have an informational interview or just a conversation with them before anything happens. Because it's tough to build a relationship while you need facts and information. So when the new police chief would come, when which there was quite a bit of turnover in Sitka when I was there, when the new city administrator would come, there was quite a bit of turnover when I was there too. There were a lot of times where I would go and just talk to them and say, what's going on? How's your new job? What is your relationship to the media? What was your relationship to the media in your past job? And then I can kind of get a sense of their media literacy and their attitudes toward the media, and use it as an opportunity to build trust and address maybe misconceptions about how community media could work. And I wish I had figured this out sooner, but that's life. Like those before the fire conversations can be really valuable when you need the kinds of things Michelle's talking about. Like, I need an answer, and the circumstances are tense, and the city's looking really bad right now, or this agency's looking really bad right now. There's one person who maybe trusts you because you put in the time before you needed them for your story. I do think that can go a long way. And setting expectations is being really clear on how you intend to use their interview, like for what purpose. And that's where having a mission statement for each interview is good. And I share that mission statement with my source. So I'll say, utility director Brian Bertacci, people want to know why the utility rates are so high. And when so many people can't afford to pay their bills, how do you justify these rates in light of the fact that a third of Sitkans are struggling? I want people to hear from you why that is. I don't really like ever doing gotcha questions, because I think it kind of messes up the power dynamics and people don't behave like humans. They behave like they just got attacked. That doesn't like do the public a service, you know? So I like to be really open with my sources about the mission statement of the interview, of like why I'm asking them and how it will be used. Will it be on the record and explaining what that means, or will it be off the record and explaining what that means? And be really, really, really clear up front. So if you haven't had time to prepare, that's fine, but you should communicate still how you intend to use the interview. And if they have no media literacy at all, you may have to take it back even further and say, like, who you work for. Here are some examples of other stories I've done. I'm going to give you a week to look through those so you know who you're talking to.
This is huge. And I think something that people overlook constantly is, like, I can't tell you how many times I've done an interview and the person has said, so this is going to be on TV tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like, no, I'm, with the Anchorage Daily News.
They have no idea.
Yeah. And so you absolutely just like, don't assume that people know who we are or what we do. So a lot of people think that, like, people might think that you get paid interview by, like that you're somehow personally making money, like all this money on their specific story. Like I've gotten that. I mean, people just don't understand, or they think because their business, bought an ad once that this is they're going to receive some kind of favorable treatment. People don't know. And so you have to be super, super transparent with them about everything you're doing, what's going to happen, what the steps are, where it's going to appear, what they can expect to control and what they cannot expect to control, and the off the record thing is really tricky. I am of the mind that, again, public officials, people who are professionals in PR, I'm really judicious about if someone says, can we go off the record? Sometimes it's like, well, why? Like, like, no, actually we can't. But with people who are civilians, like, they need to really understand what that means. What is off the record? What is on the record? And in this sheet that Emily and I kind of put together, one thing that I like really discourage is people jumping between on and off the record during an interview. I don't know if any of you have ever had people try to do that, but that's really problematic because it puts you in a bad place, it puts them in a bad place, and it's something that you should feel free to like stop and call out and be like, we need to be very clear and both have a mutual understanding of what is on the record and off the record here. I'd prefer if we could keep the content of this entire conversation either on or off the record, and we both need to understand that. And so I think that just goes back to, like, it's a scary thing to be interviewed by someone, and to put your trust in a stranger who's going to put your name and possibly your voice or your image in the media. I often think, like, I don't know that I would say yes if someone wanted to interview me. And so you really do have to just be straight with them as much as possible, while at the same time not be scared of it, not be scared to make that phone call or walk up to somebody. So
yeah, that's great advice. You mentioned the guide that you and Michelle, that you and Emily put together. I'm going to put it in the chat here. People can start looking at it, and then we'll talk about it in a little bit. And thanks to everybody who's weighing in here. The expectations, the talk about expectations and letting people know what we're doing definitely resonated with folks. So thank you for participating there. But I do want to, Emily has some tape to play, which will be fun, I think, of when things don't necessarily go as well as planned. Right, Emily?
Yeah. Do you want to set this up, Annie?
I think you should set it up, but it's just, yeah. When, yeah.
Because Annie has listened to more audio pieces than anyone in the entire state, but you only get like, you've listened to a ton of raw interviews too.
Yeah.
What do you think is the number one thing audio people could do differently in interviews? And then I might have tape to actually prove when I did exactly the opposite of what.
Oh, man, that's a hard one. I mean, I think, well, stepping on people when they're saying something good is a common mistake, and just making sure you're listening really well in the interview, and letting somebody respond, like fully respond, and hearing what they're saying and adjusting your questions as you go, depending on what they're saying. But you might have other examples.
I remember coming to, I think Annie is 1,000% right that sometimes the best thing someone's gonna say is just around the bend of you pausing instead of just jumping in with another question. And I've had to sit on my teeth. I've had to be like, don't say anything. Don't do it. Don't do it. Let them take a long pause.
The silence, yeah.
And then they know, because they're a person who talks to people, that you are creating some space for them to reflect further. And even if it's awkward, sometimes on the other side is something really revelatory. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're like, do you have another question? But I have some tape that is of just how easy it is to ask a question that's like meandering and closed. Michelle and I were talking about the compound question.
Yeah.
This is a huge problem for me, compound questions.
How would you describe it? And then I will play some tape of me doing this. How would you describe the nemesis, the compound question?
I mean, it's something like, so, I mean, I'm really interested. Could you tell me about when you were in the Anchorage Assembly and some of the, challenges of the 1970s, and how did that affect your interest in reforming the PFC later? And, it's like you're asking like this series of questions in one question, and then people will say, they'll either say like, wow, that was a big question, or they'll say like, well, you asked 4 different questions there. And either way, it's a mess. And it just reflects, if you don't have the question fully formed in your head, it's going to come out like that as you say it, and you will not get to what the actual single question is in a clear way.
Okay. Yes. I'm going to play some tape of this phenomenon. It's not as like, I wish I had like really dug for my worst compound question, but I think I instead just found like whatever was fastest. Okay, so this is an interview. Can you all see actually, let me make sure I did sharing my system. Yeah, okay. Can you all see MTE? This is like our audio editing software at NPR.
Yes.
So I was talking to these 2 scientists named Adam Rutherford and Hannah Fry, who are the hosts of this podcast called The Curious Cases of Rutherford and Fry, where they use science to sleuth. It's a little bit Sherlock Holmes-esque. They're very British. They're very verbose. They're very funny. And kind of like Annie is saying, I'm listening to them talk, and some of the questions are ones I planned and some of them I didn't. And they were kind of based on things they said. So at one point they're talking about their friendship, and I'm realizing, part of what makes their scientific work so interesting is they are doing it in collaboration with somebody who's not in their discipline. Hannah's a mathematician, Adam is a geneticist, really different disciplines. And I'm like, I want to ask them about it, but it's not going to be the worst tape you've ever heard. It's just like, the question is not great.
Do you think through your friendship with each other, you know even better how to figure things out? than you did when you were just simply doing traditional, I say simply, I can't do it, when you were doing scientific research, using the methods of the academy? What's changed?
Okay, that's not a question. I mean, they're so gracious that they responded like, yeah, our friendship, but I'm like thinking out loud. I haven't actually formulated my question. I should have just taken a minute to like write out my question, which is, how has your friendship impacted your work? Open-ended question. Instead, I ask close-ended. I would assume your friendship impacts your work because of all these reasons, right? They don't need to hear my close-ended assumption. I got there in the end with something more open-ended, but it was through this like meandering, close-ended external processing. And even after like interviewing people for 8 years, I'm still doing it. It's hard. It's hard to stop yourself. Here's an example of a question that is a little bit more concise. So Hannah's talking about how in science, there's no like single truth, and that can be hard for people to understand. I'll just play you this exchange.
I mean that, but we also both really think that we're right.
Oh, here we no, let me play this.
We think it's really important that people recognize that science is about disagreement and about challenging ideas, and the discussions that we have. It's an ever-moving target. We talk about how science is, we tend towards truth, but never find it.
I mean that, but we also both really think that we're right. and it was important to have the final.
So I'm like, okay, interesting. Science isn't like absolute truth. It's just moving towards truth, but never being right there. And I managed to process internally and just say in one sentence, like something pretty succinct. And it's a close-ended question, but you'll kind of hear the difference as far as the direction I'm giving her as to what I'm asking her.
I mean that, but we also both really think that we're right. and it was important to have the final word.
Yeah.
Do you think the public understands this about science? This aspect?
I don't know if they do, actually. I don't know if they do. And I think that is something that has really shown itself, really been laid bare over the last couple of years. I think that.
So that was like a single question on the fly. It was clear, it was focused. They knew what I was asking them. And it made it into the piece because it really led someplace. The other thing the last thing I'll say about interviewing for audio, because we have this weird job where we can like edit people together, it is okay to ask someone to repeat what they've said in a more concise way. I think that is something that I've learned from the podcasting world that I never would have done before, but I do it right here where they were just going on and on and on. And I was like, ooh, so this is how I did it.
You've just witnessed part of our creative process here, which is we start off with something that we've half remembered, that we read on the back of a packet of chips somewhere or heard on the radio, and struggled our way through, and then, oh yeah, we got it.
And then just say it again with confidence, and suddenly people think you're an effective science communicator.
Yeah, it's the story of LIGO and gold.
To how did scientists ultimately figure out how old the Earth was? Can you say that in brief?
In brief, what the ring story, but shorter.
Just so we have it in one sentence.
Yep. Oh yeah, okay.
And I was terrified, by the way, saying to Hannah, my famous British mathematician, like, can you just say that more succinctly? But I had to, and it allowed for us to keep her example in the piece in a way that was just more coherent, because she was kind of figuring out what she wanted to say. So I just gave her the chance to say that again. And I do think that's okay to do when you're directing somebody in an interview, to take another stab at it.
That's such a great tip. I don't think I've ever done that, but especially with scientists, right? Or complicated subjects. That'd be really helpful. Michelle, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just thinking of like some phrases that I found myself using in this kind of podcast narrative interviewing at the direction of my very experienced producer, like, take me there, walk me through how that works, or like, take me to that place, describe the room for me, like, just prompting them with these almost therapist-like things to like prompts, because what I was doing was the opposite, not trying to get them to sum something up in a nutshell, but to get them to like expound with sensory detail and to really paint a picture. And there's just words and prompts you can use. And hopefully we've added some of those into that little document that can be really effective in interviewing. And one of them that I think is incredibly powerful for when you need to push back or go deeper is, what would you say to people who say you're contributing to climate change or whatever it is, whatever the criticism is or the hard thing is, framing it as, what would you say to people who say this, think this about you? It's a nice way to kind of in a neutral way ask somebody a tough question that feels like it has a little bit of remove, but also goes there, gives them a chance to directly respond to it.
Yeah, I see someone in the chat adding a good question is, so what I hear you saying is, I think that is a good idea too, just to make sure you do understand what they're saying and it gives them a chance to restate things. So should where I feel like we're maybe running out of time a little bit here, and have so much more to get to. I did want to get to, we've kind of touched on some basics, but it'd be nice to just lay them out there. And I would love people in the who are watching to weigh in the chat for their basic tips for interviewing. Two big ones that we've already talked about are ask open-ended questions. Don't ask yes or no or closed questions. Let the silence go. It's amazing what can happen when you just embrace the awkwardness there for however long it lasts. What about you guys? Do you have other things to add in there?
I think that
Maybe avoid the compound question.
The compound question.
Yeah.
Like really refine, like, what is your question?
Yeah. Yeah. Try to avoid being in the place of having to do that external processing out loud while asking another question, which is again, like being really comfortable with silence in interviews. Like after someone says something, it's okay to take a very long, awkwardly long, thoughtful pause as you try to formulate what you really want to know next. And that can help you avoid the compound question trap.
Yeah. Someone in the chat mentions active listening. That I think is a huge one that makes such a difference.
This is why Angela Denning gets such good tape right here.
Yeah. Oh, that's Angela. Hi, Angela.
Angela takes the time to just pause.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I think one thing for me is I am often interviewing people who are in some way traumatized or grieving or otherwise sharing something really emotional and personal and difficult. And always in interviews like that, if the person agrees to talk with you, it's absolutely appropriate and important, I think, to start the interview with like an acknowledgement of like that person's pain and like what they're going through, and like that can be something like, like I'm just, before we start, I just want to say how sorry I am for your loss, or like I just want to say like this, I'm really sorry. And people time and time again have said, wow, like no one else has said that. If they've talked to other media. I think that that's just human. And for some reason, sometimes I think reporters are like afraid to do that because it might make them seem too, I don't know, emotional or, but that I just like, you can't go wrong. You have to do that.
Yeah.
In my mind.
Yeah, I think too, we sometimes assume that that person who's been through something so hard doesn't want to share their story. And that's not always the case. Often they do want to under the right circumstances. So
yeah,
going into it, with that in mind.
Yeah.
too. Thanks everyone for all these great notes here. Emily, you talked a little bit about making the interviewee more of a collaborator in the process. And I'm really interested to hear you talk more about what you mean by that.
Yes, I think this is something that doesn't suit all stories. Certainly, accountability journalism, investigative journalism, fact-finding, like day turn work. You can't really do that necessarily. I say that, but maybe I'm wrong. With features and with profiles and with investigative, that's like a little more built out. I do think you can think about your sources as collaborators sometimes and develop some unique partnerships, whether it's with a tribe or with an agency, and you have to disclose that formal collaboration. But then there's also informal collaboration. And I have an example, which is we did a story about how in Australia, there was this album of endangered bird songs that was like climbing the charts. Like it was dethroning Taylor Swift and Ed Sheeran, and like it only didn't top Adele. And it was this cellist who had gone out of his way to make an album of birds. It's just bird songs, like in the clean. And my teammate Burley said, wouldn't it be funny if we did this almost like a game show where the musician had to listen to the bird song and then give a fact about the bird and then guess the bird? So we came up with this whole other format for the interview that wasn't like question, answer. It was, but it was a game. And it brought this guy to life in this funny way that you'd have to, I'll drop the link to it. He knew we were going to do this. We didn't spring it on him. Burley talked to him and said, like, we would like to try this as a game. What do you think about that? And then he gave us ideas and we built the game around his ideas. And I think we do this all the time on Shortwave. Like we're trying to make it interactive and participatory and do a little more power sharing with our guests. Again, it's not appropriate for all stories, but it's been pretty eye-opening to see what happens when you do that. And I think the bird song is not the most like I don't know. It's like a low stakes way of collaborating, but it just showed me what was possible, and I could imagine using that kind of format for other things, not game shows, but just like thinking about ways to collaborate with your sources on projects.
Yeah. Very cool. I have some more questions here, but I want to save time for questions from people watching. So let's start with that. Does anybody have questions they want to ask? I think you can, maybe somebody else can weigh in here. I think we can unmute you maybe, or you can put it in the chat. Oh, Olivia. Okay, Olivia.
Okay, I'm going to do my best to ask this question in a really open-ended way and a not profound way. Emily, this question is for you specifically, but feel free to weigh in too, Michelle. I know you have like a decade of experience. But with scientists, how do you get them to sound interesting and engaging? Because I find someone like can be so in the weeds. And then, so that's one question. And I have a follow-up. I can wait for it after you answer.
Their profession does not encourage them to do this, unfortunately, because of scientific objectivity aspirations. So it's not their fault. And I think that some scientists are learning to break out of it, but not all. Sometimes it's as simple as booking a scientist who you know is not as rigid, even if that means they're, let's say, in a PhD program and don't have a PhD yet, etc. But if you don't have the option of like booking someone who might be a little more animated, I use a lot of tricks. I ask them about like just to start telling these stories about when they first encountered this topic as kids, the weirdest or scariest or most disturbing thing that happened in the lab or under the ocean or in the, I don't know, the freezer. Scientists do bonkers stuff. And sometimes they don't see it that way because it's just their job. But I think kind of bringing your energy as they tell those stories and getting them to laugh, it just starts to form that human connection. So I really do hype up scientists in a way that I didn't other sources. I feel like a hype woman sometimes as I'm talking to them. I'm like, that's so cool. And they're like, I guess it is cool. And then they suddenly start to go and go and go. So, and it's not manufactured. It's just from really kind of when I do the prep, like really understanding kind of what they're about and thinking, okay, if I was their PR person, how would I want coming up with metaphors? So they'll say something and then I'm like, oh, it's kind of like you're the like Miss Frizzle of food science. And they're like, I am like the Miss Frizzle of food science. That's correct. And then and I'm like, what's your favorite Magic School Bus episode? And they're like, oh my gosh, it's the one where Arnold does this. And actually that's why I became a scientist. You know, like just, I throw like random playful things at them on purpose. Like the game show was also because the guest was kind of dry. And we were like, we need something to. And then the last thing I'll say is if you can go to where they work, they tend to come alive more. If it's possible, it's not always possible because of access, time, money, pandemic, but it is fun to go out with scientists in the field. Yeah.
I think that is something that we haven't explicitly said, and I feel like you all kind of intuitively know it, but interviews are so much better in person. Like almost, though phone interviews can be, or like Zoom interviews can be really special too, but there's just something you lose by not being able to see that person, and ideally in their space, right? In the context of where their lab or their office or their field work spot or their home, there's something that just, it adds so much to the interview if you can do it there.
I agree 100%. Olivia, did you have another question?
Yeah, my other question was just like, do you have the benefit, I guess, of being able to cut scientists who are overly dry, like pre-interviewing scientists?
This is something Michelle was saying. You didn't know about this weird thing we do in audio, the pre-interview.
Yeah, that's not really a thing as much in like, usually like if you want to interview someone, you might call them and say, hey, can we do an interview, and then do the interview. But this like pre-interview to kind of get a sample of how they're going to talk is really, really useful because you can kind of screen people too. Like maybe this isn't the right person to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely have not used guests for that purpose. And I also think I call it on my team, I call it the tyranny of the good talker. Like often the people who get booked are people who like have media literacy, have like college degrees, are like overwhelmingly white or male. And, there's this like problem we fall into if we define what a good talker sounds like. So mindful of that, I do think about how like, is it that they're not a good talker or I'm just not asking the right questions? Is it I'm not positioning myself as the right listener? And it's interesting what can happen when you start to shift it that way and challenge yourself to be to break out of your own shtick and your own format. People can kind of come out in a different way. So I wouldn't discourage you from booking a scientist who's dry if you can find a way in a pre-interview to see other dimensions to their personality. But if you try and it doesn't work, then maybe another guest is the best one. But if people who aren't on camera on an interview aren't given a chance to interview, they'll never practice. They have to be given a chance somehow. So I think I love shortwave because we are often like scooping up people who aren't interviewed very often. Yeah. But that's, again, doesn't apply when you're like local reporter and you need to call the fire chief. Like there's only one fire chief. So I recognize that for sure.
Okay, a few questions here in the chat. Lex says, do you have any specific examples of successes you've had getting civilians to talk if they're hesitant? What was it that ultimately convinced them to go on the record? I'm particularly curious about talking to media skeptical conservatives, but also just people in general.
I've got some experience with that. I think you have to convince them that at the most basic level that you are reaching out to them because you want to offer them a chance to share their perspective. No more, no less. And even if they distrust your media organization, even hate your media organization, if they recognize the, I guess, power of that opportunity, that maybe it really would be a good idea for me to share my perspective because I don't feel it's getting heard, because I feel that it's being maligned, and I can trust this reporter enough when she says, I want to give you a chance to share your perspective. I think that people really respond to that, and also like making sure that they understand that you are not responsible for the editorials or the opinions that your media organization publishes, that your job is separate, that you are not here to promote any viewpoint. I think that can really go a long way. And again, like being really upfront about that process, like this is how the interview is going to work. This is what you will have an opportunity to do. This is what you will not have an opportunity to do, like read the story before it's published. Just making sure that they understand every step of what you're doing, I think helps to build trust. And I don't know, I've had people like in the last 2 years particularly be like, well, the ADN is terrible for all these reasons, but, I'm going to talk to you because nobody else is, and nobody else, like, you guys don't care about people like me. And so I want to say what I have to say. And I hope that those people have felt fairly treated by me, and by the newspaper. And I think in general, they do, once they have that personal experience with being interviewed. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. We are getting a lot of questions in here now and have not very much time left.
Tom, not your fault, Tom. No.
How do you respond to people who may lose confidence after an interview on a sensitive topic and worry about the
I've
consequences?
definitely had people ghost me.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
Boy, I think you have to do like a real, like, this is something where you would have to talk to your editor too. Like if the person's like, hey, I gave you that interview, we had an understanding that it was all on the record, that it was going to be part of your story, but I am trying to back out now. That's something where you just have to, like, I think, take it up a level. Like, let me talk to my editor. Because, I think a lot of people, like, they want to know how you're going to portray them and what you're going to choose from, the interview, and they want to know that they're not going to be misrepresented. And no, we cannot show them a story before it's out. You should never do that. But what I do think you can do is you can put them at ease by fact checking with them. And sometimes that means like going assertion by assertion through what they've said, what you're planning to put in your story, and being like, is that correct? And so there are very, very few circumstances where it's really like, you don't want to surprise people, and also being clear to them that this is not an opportunity for you to change what you said or to try to make yourself sound different or to alter quotes in any way. This is just like a fact checking of assertions. That seems to really go a long way for some people in just making them feel like they have a little more insight and transparency into the process. And it's not control. It's just a look at what's going to happen before it becomes public.
It's kind of another way to make your source a collaborator, not a true collaborator, but I thought it was such a journalistic taboo to let anyone read anything you write about them. And then upon being interviewed by other people, I actually really love the courtesy of kind of knowing what's going to be out there. And I think it's how you do it is you get them on the phone and you say, okay, this paragraph, I'm going to read it aloud to you, or you email it to them. And I just want to ask you if this is all true. Or does this accurately represent what you intended? And sometimes this is where your instincts are really important. There were times in Alaska where someone would say something and I knew the way they said it looked bad and did not reflect their intention. Like they just didn't say the right words, but it wasn't out of context. It didn't represent their position at all. A good journalist would know that and follow up with them and say, you know, you said this, did you mean this? And I really do think that you may see that as somehow a missed opportunity, but I see that as you doing your due diligence to represent the truth. And then that person knows that you're a journalist who cares about those kinds of nuances and context, and they're more likely to want to talk to you again when an even more challenging story comes up. And like when I would cover Sitka Tribe of Alaska, I would like go to their meetings and use those stories as opportunities to show them those sources, how I do my work, and have conversations along the way so that like when we would talk about more difficult things, they were like, well, I trust Emily. Like I know that she's taking things fully in context. And people would ghost me way less. But it took time, actually, more than anything. Time and like proving myself over and over again. Yeah.
Such a good point. And I think a good point to end on. We've run out of time.
Oh my
There's a lot more to get to as expected. So thank you, Emily Kwong and Michelle Terrio Boots. That was really awesome. The session on Wednesday, Tegan Hanlon is leading. It's with, I'm not going to pronounce his name right, but Tom Huang with the Dallas Morning News. And that will be on focusing your story. I'm really excited to join that one. So everyone should pop back on again bright and early, 8 a.m. on Wednesday. And I think that's it. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, you've all been a delight. And I just want to say I'm like always available.
Yeah.
Really, anyone on here has a interviewing troubleshooting or trying to, you know, secure an interview question or just nervousness. I really like message me, email me, whatever. I'd love to talk this stuff through. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. This was really awesome. This is Tegan again. I just wanted to give a quick reminder that Rosie's popped them in the chat. There's like 4 things that we're trying to remind folks of. There's a merch fundraiser, and like so many things in journalism, it comes with a deadline. So you can only order stuff until April 14th. There's some cool hoodies and t-shirts with the logo on. We also have a survey about this session. If you could take a few minutes to fill it out, it will help us plan for next year's conference and other events. And then we have the awards coming up on April 30th. There's an RSVP there. They're going to be virtual and in person. There's going to be a small event at King Street Brewery on April 29th from 6 to 9 p.m., which should be pretty fun if you can make it in town, or you can apply for a grant to host an in-person gathering at your station or in your community. So definitely check that out. But yeah, hope to see you guys on Wednesday. And thanks so much, Michelle and Emily and Annie. This was really great and informative. I'm going to write JCTF on a Post-it note and stare at it all day. Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Tegan.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.